Jacksonville Beach, Florida. February 16, 2022. The hum of a black Volkswagen Atlas is the only sound on a desolate, wooded stretch of Sanctuary Boulevard. Inside, 33-year-old Jared Bridegan is finishing a routine task, dropping his older twins off at his ex-wife's house. In the back seat, his 2-year-old daughter is strapped into her car seat, oblivious to the darkness pressing against the windows. Then, the trap snaps shut. A lone tire sits upright in the middle of the lane, an obstacle that feels accidental but is surgically placed. Jared, a man defined by his sense of order, shifts the vehicle into park and steps out to move it. He never touches the rubber. Gunshots tear through the humid night. Several rounds fired at point-blank range. Jared collapses onto the asphalt, his life ending inches from the open door. For several minutes, the only witness is a toddler staring through the glass as the hazard lights pulse rhythmically against her father's body. A Microsoft executive, a father of 4, and a target left for dead in a cold, calculated ambush. Please support the channel by subscribing and liking this video. Thank you so much. Jared Bridegan was a man of architecture, not of steel and stone, but of code and human experience. As a senior design manager at Microsoft, his professional life was a study in precision. He was paid to anticipate errors before they happened, to build digital environments that were seamless and logical. Those who worked alongside him in the corporate corridors of the tech giant described a man who carried that same intentionality into his personal life. He was a father who didn't just provide, he curated. He was the parent who built elaborate playhouses by hand and meticulously planned weekend excursions to the Florida coastline. A man whose moral compass was fixed firmly on the doctrines of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints. For Jared, life was a series of commitments to his craft, to his faith, and, above all, to his children. Across the table from this structured existence stood Shanna Gardner. She didn't just come from wealth, she came from a dynasty. Her family was the driving force behind Stampin' Up!, a multi-level marketing colossus that transformed the humble hobby of scrapbooking into a global billion-dollar empire. Shanna grew up in Alpine, Utah, a mountain-ringed enclave where the air is thin and the bank accounts are deep. Her mother, Shelly Gardner, was a titan of the craft world, and Shanna was raised with the poise of an heiress and the expectations of a high-society Mormon daughter. She was athletic, blonde, and possessed a quiet, steely confidence. The kind of self-assurance that is born from never having to worry about the cost of a mistake. The two met in the early 2000s in Utah, the spiritual and cultural epicenter of their shared world. To the observers in their social circles, they were the golden couple. They were young, attractive, and seemingly perfectly aligned in their ambitions and their piety. Their wedding in 2010 at the Salt Lake Temple was a grand, traditional affair, a union that was, according to their faith, intended to last for all eternity. It was a day defined by white stone, filtered sunlight, and the heavy, hopeful weight of religious expectation. They were the ideal representatives of their community, a testament to the success of the traditional LDS path. The early years of the marriage were a whirlwind of upward mobility. Jared's career took them from Utah to Connecticut, and eventually to the humid, sun-drenched suburbs of Jacksonville Beach, Florida. They weren't just living the American dream, they were living a high-definition, luxury version of it. In 2012, their world expanded with the arrival of twins, a boy and a girl. For a time, the Bridegan household was a masterclass in domestic equilibrium. Jared threw himself into fatherhood with the same religious fervor he applied to his work, applying his meticulous nature to developmental milestones and nursery decorations. However, the move to Florida seemed to act as a catalyst for a subterranean shift in Shanna. The coastal lifestyle and the distance from the watchful eyes of the Alpine community began to peel away the layers of her traditional upbringing. While Jared remained steadfast in his devotion to the church and the structured life they had built, Shanna began to drift. She became increasingly preoccupied with alternative lifestyles, radical health fads, intensive yoga, and philosophies that began to clash with the rigid doctrines of their faith. This wasn't a simple disagreement over hobbies, it was a fundamental divergence of souls. The man who lived by a strict code of conduct and the woman who was beginning to view that code as a cage were suddenly speaking two different languages. The silence in their sprawling home grew heavy with unspoken resentment. Shanna began to view Jared's stability as stifling, while Jared viewed Shanna's awakening as a betrayal of their eternal vows. The foundation of the golden couple was not just cracking, it was dissolving into a toxic slurry of ideological warfare. By the time the legal documents were filed in 2015, the eternal union had lasted only 5 years, but the war that followed would last much longer. The Salt Lake Temple wedding was meant to be a sealing, a promise of permanence that transcended the physical world and reached into the eternal. For the Gardner and Bridegan families, the 2010 ceremony was a coronation of two young people who represented the pinnacle of their faith's social order. But as the couple transitioned from the dry, high-altitude air of Utah to the humid coastal sprawl of Jacksonville Beach, Florida, the meticulously crafted veneer began to crack. The change wasn't instantaneous. It was a slow, agonizing erosion of common ground. The birth of their twins in 2012 should have been the final piece of the domestic puzzle, yet it only served to highlight the widening chasm between their philosophies. Jared remained tethered to the structure of the church, finding comfort in the clear boundaries of their faith and the discipline of his career at Microsoft. He was a man who lived by the clock and the code. Shanna, however, was undergoing a radical internal transformation. The distance from Alpine, Utah, seemed to grant her the permission she needed to deconstruct the perfect Mormon daughter persona. She began to immerse herself in alternative health circles, intensive yoga practices, and a worldview that prioritized personal autonomy over religious obligation. She wasn't just changing her lifestyle, she was changing her soul. By 2015, the golden couple was a memory, replaced by two strangers living under a roof heavy with unspoken animosity. When Shanna filed for divorce, she didn't just ask for a legal separation, she initiated a tactical campaign. The initial filing marked the start of what local court observers would eventually call one of the most contentious and vitriolic custody battles in the history of Duval County. The court docket swelled to hundreds of entries, a paper trail of spite that documented every perceived slight and every minor disagreement over the children's upbringing. The couple initially attempted a nesting arrangement, a system where the children remained in the family home while the parents rotated in and out. It was a strategy designed for cooperation, but in the hands of Jared and Shanna, it became a theater of psychological warfare. Jared would later describe a home life defined by surveillance and hostility. He claimed Shanna had installed cameras to monitor his every move, and that the environment had become so toxic it was untenable. The arrangement collapsed under the weight of mutual distrust, and the legal battle transitioned into a grueling war of attrition. Shanna's family wealth, the vast resources of the Stampin' Up! Empire, provided her with a nearly bottomless war chest for litigation. She could afford to keep Jared in court indefinitely, contesting every weekend schedule, every medical decision, and every educational choice. Jared, while successful in his own right, was a man on a salary, fighting against a billionaire's trust fund. The disparity was palpable. Friends noted that Jared seemed to be aging in real time, the stress of the constant legal threats etching deep lines into his face. Despite the chaos, Jared managed to find a second chance at peace. In 2017, he met Kirsten, a woman who offered the stability and shared values he had been mourning. Their relationship was the antithesis of his first marriage. It was quiet, supportive, and grounded in a mutual desire for a large, happy family. They married and soon had 2 children of their own. Jared's new life in the Jacksonville suburbs was a sanctuary, a place of Lego sets, Sunday dinners, and the laughter of 4 children. But the shadow of the first marriage never truly receded. The custody exchanges remained the most stressful points of his week, minutes of cold silence and sharp glares that felt like a prelude to something darker. As Jared built his new family, Shanna was building a new life of her own. She met Mario Fernandez Saldana at her CrossFit gym, and the two quickly became inseparable. Mario was different from Jared in every conceivable way, less structured, more impulsive, and seemingly willing to mirror Shanna's growing resentment toward her ex-husband. They married, and Mario moved into Shanna's world, becoming a secondary participant in the ongoing legal feud. Behind the scenes, the rhetoric was becoming increasingly dangerous. Shanna was no longer just complaining about Jared. She was allegedly exploring ways to remove him from the equation entirely. Witnesses would later recount chilling conversations in which Shanna allegedly asked for recommendations for someone who could get rid of her ex-husband. She reportedly told a tattoo artist that she was tired of Jared's interference and needed him out of the picture. These weren't just the vents of a frustrated divorcee, they were the first tremors of a murderous intent. Jared felt the shift. He told Kirsten and his close friends that he felt watched, that the tension had moved beyond the courtroom and into the physical world. He was a man who lived by logic, yet he couldn't shake the primal feeling that he was being hunted. The Great Divide had moved past the point of legal mediation. Shanna Gardner had spent years trying to break Jared Bridegan through the court system, and when the law failed to erase him, she began to look for a more permanent solution, a trap that would be set on a dark road, far from the eyes of a judge. The financial pressure continued to mount as the Gardner family allegedly cut off some of the support Shanna had relied on, perhaps hoping she would find a way to end the conflict. Instead, it seems to have accelerated her desperation. To Shanna, Jared wasn't just a father to her children, he was a barrier to her total control, a ghost from her past life that refused to stop haunting her future. The decade-long battle had stripped away her empathy, leaving only a cold, calculated drive for elimination. Jared wanted a co-parent. Shanna wanted a void. The mundane rituals of co-parenting are often defined by a weary, predictable rhythm, a series of handoffs that mark the transition from one world to another. On Wednesday, February 16, 2022, the atmosphere in Jacksonville Beach was thick with the usual Florida humidity, and for 33-year-old Jared Bridegan, the evening followed a script he had rehearsed 100 times before. It was his scheduled date night with his 9-year-old twins, a cherished midweek window of normalcy amidst the ongoing legal friction with his ex-wife, Shanna. He had treated the children to dinner, a simple meal filled with the lighthearted chatter of middle schoolers, before steering his black Volkswagen Atlas toward the Marsh Inlet Court neighborhood to return them to their mother's care. At approximately 7:30 p.m., Jared pulled into the driveway of the upscale residence. The exchange was brief, characterized by the practiced coldness that had become the standard between the former spouses. Jared didn't linger. His 2-year-old daughter, Bexley, was still strapped into her car seat in the back, and the drive back to his home in St. Johns County would take nearly 40 minutes. He secured the twins, offered his goodbyes, and backed out of the driveway, unaware that his movements were being monitored with predatory precision. As the SUV glided through the winding, manicured streets of the coastal community, the environment was deceptively serene. Sanctuary Boulevard is the kind of road where residents feel the safety of exclusivity, a corridor of luxury homes and dense foliage where the loudest sound is often the wind in the palms. Jared turned onto a particularly dark stretch of the boulevard, a wooded area in the 4000 block where the streetlights are sparse and the shadows long. He was roughly 2 miles from Shanna's house when the routine drive was interrupted by a jarring anomaly. In the center of the narrow lane, illuminated by the Volkswagen's headlights, sat a spare tire. It was standing upright, a jagged, out-of-place silhouette that felt like a careless accident, a piece of debris fallen from a passing truck. For a man like Jared, a meticulous professional and a father who prioritized safety, the tire wasn't just an obstacle, it was a hazard that needed to be cleared. He couldn't simply swerve around it without risking the safety of other drivers on the narrow path. He slowed the vehicle to a crawl and shifted into park. The interior of the car remained bathed in the soft glow of the dashboard lights. Jared reached over and activated the hazard lights, the rhythmic click-cluck of the blinkers echoing against the quiet of the cabin where his toddler sat. He stepped out into the night air, leaving the driver's side door open, a momentary lapse in caution, born from the belief that he was in a safe, residential sanctuary. He walked toward the rear of the vehicle, his focus entirely on the heavy rubber obstacle. Then, the silence of Sanctuary Boulevard was shattered. Short, sharp cracks echoed through the trees, the unmistakable sound of gunfire tearing through the humid air. There was no warning, no demand for money, no struggle. The shooter emerged from the darkness of the tree line with a singular, lethal intent. Jared was struck multiple times at close range, the impact of the bullets sending him collapsing onto the pavement right next to the open door of his SUV. He fell in a pool of his own blood, his body coming to rest in the strobe-like pulse of the emergency flashers he had just turned on. The horror of the moment was amplified by the small, wide-eyed witness in the back seat. Bexley, just 2 years old, was trapped in her car seat as the violence unfolded inches from her window. At least one round had been fired with such reckless disregard that it passed through the vehicle's interior, missing the toddler's head by a mere matter of inches. For several minutes, the child was left alone in the dark, her father's lifeless form sprawled on the asphalt just outside the door, while the killer melted back into the dense Floridian shadows. Witnesses later described seeing a person walking, then running, southbound away from the scene just seconds after the final shot was fired. Another driver, arriving at the scene minutes later, found the Volkswagen blocking the road, its lights still flashing a desperate, rhythmic warning. The passerby recounted the haunting sound of a child's muffled cries coming from the darkened interior. Upon approaching, the witness discovered Jared's body and realized with a jolt of terror that a toddler was still inside. Local residents, alerted by the sudden eruption of noise, trickled out of their homes. One neighbor told investigators that the shots sounded like a rapid succession of firecrackers, but the heavy silence that followed felt wrong, laden with a sudden, suffocating weight. By 8:03 p.m., the first patrol cars arrived, their blue and red lights joining the frantic blink of Jared's hazard lights to illuminate a scene that felt like a nightmare made manifest. The tire remained in the road, a silent, rubber sentinel that had served its purpose as the bait for an ambush. The investigation would later reveal that the shooter had not acted on impulse. The targeted nature of the killing was evident in the precision of the hit and the choice of the location. Jared Bridegan had left his ex-wife's home with a plan for the next morning, a schedule for the rest of his week, and a heart full of devotion to his children. In a span of less than 60 seconds, that entire future was erased on a quiet Jacksonville road, leaving a family shattered and a 2-year-old girl to be carried away by strangers while her father lay still in the street. While the blue and red lights of the emergency vehicles still pulsed against the tree line of Sanctuary Boulevard, a different kind of darkness was settling over a home just a few miles away. Kirsten Bridegan was waiting. It was a school night, a routine night, the kind of evening where the house is filled with the quiet clutter of a young family. But the minutes turned into an hour, and the text messages she sent to Jared remained unread, the gray bubbles hanging in the digital void. When the knock finally came, it wasn't the sound of a key in the lock. It was the heavy, rhythmic thud of authority. The news of Jared's death hit Jacksonville Beach like a tidal wave. In a community where the crime rate is often defined by minor thefts or noise complaints, a cold-blooded execution on a public road was a glitch in the reality of the residents. The social echo was immediate and deafening. Sanctuary Boulevard, a name that now felt like a cruel irony, became a site of pilgrimage. Bunches of flowers, handwritten notes, and stuffed animals began to pile up near the spot where the tire had been placed. But beneath the public mourning, a darker current was beginning to circulate. The rumor mill in an affluent suburb is a vicious thing, and within 48 hours, the whispers had converged on a single name: Shanna. The community's fear was eclipsed only by their confusion at the behavior of the victim's ex-wife. In the wake of a tragedy involving the father of her children, the expected response is one of shared grief, or, at the very least, a somber cooperation. Shanna Gardner offered neither. While Kirsten Bridegan was standing before television cameras, her voice trembling as she pleaded for information, Shanna remained behind the gates of her mother's influence. She didn't attend the vigils. She didn't reach out to Kirsten to offer a word of comfort. Most tellingly, she didn't allow Jared's older twins to attend their father's funeral. This wasn't just a private mourning, it was a tactical withdrawal. To the public, it looked like the ultimate act of spite, denying children the right to say goodbye to a father who had worshipped them. To the investigators, it was a massive neon red flag. The psychological profile of the grieved ex-wife was being replaced by something much more clinical and detached. Shanna hired a high-powered criminal defense attorney before the police had even named a suspect. It was a move that signaled not just a desire for privacy, but a preparation for war. As the weeks turned into months, the investigation seemed to stall, creating a vacuum that was filled by local paranoia. Was there a random killer stalking the dark roads of Jacksonville? Was it a botched robbery? These red herrings were discussed in coffee shops and on community message boards, but the police knew better. The choice of the tire as a lure was too specific. It required a knowledge of Jared's character. It required someone who knew he wouldn't just drive past a hazard, he would stop to fix it. This wasn't a crime of opportunity. It was a crime of intimate knowledge. The frustration among the detectives was palpable. They were dealing with a billionaire's daughter narrative, a suspect with the financial resources to relocate, to insulate herself with legal shields, and to remain silent indefinitely. Indeed, Shanna soon moved across the country to West Richland, Washington, taking the twins with her and effectively cutting off the Bridegan family from the children. It was a relocation that felt like a flight from justice. Yet legally, she was a free woman. Kirsten Bridegan refused to let the case go cold. She became the face of the Justice for Jared movement, keeping his name in the headlines and his face on the news. She transformed her grief into a relentless, disciplined search for the truth. The contrast between the two women couldn't have been more stark, one standing in the light, begging for answers, the other retreating into the shadows of the Pacific Northwest, surrounded by family wealth and a wall of silence. The social atmosphere in Jacksonville Beach had changed. The sense of security that had once defined the area was gone, replaced by the knowledge that someone in their midst had possessed the coldness to orchestrate a hit while a toddler sat feet away. The tire in the road had become a symbol of a new, terrifying reality. That the most dangerous traps aren't set by strangers, but by those who once claimed to love you. The investigation was moving slowly, grinding through a mountain of digital evidence and cell tower pings, but the public had already reached its verdict. They were just waiting for the law to catch up to the rumors, and for the paper trail to lead them to the person who had turned a quiet boulevard into a kill zone. The detectives in Jacksonville Beach were not just fighting a killer, they were fighting a ghost, and a wall of seemingly infinite resources. In the first weeks following the execution of Jared Bridegan, the investigation felt like a slow-motion collapse into a void. There was no murder weapon. There were no fingerprints on the tire. The crime scene, washed by the humid Florida night, offered nothing but the rhythmic, mocking flash of the Volkswagen's hazard lights. Investigators began the grueling manual labor of modern detective work, the digital canvassing of a neighborhood defined by its privacy. They didn't just look for a shooter, they looked for a shadow. The first crack in the darkness came from a grainy frame of surveillance footage. It was a Phantom, a dark blue, mid-2000s Ford F-150 with a distinctive tan trim, captured by a Ring doorbell blocks away from Sanctuary Boulevard just minutes after the shots rang out. For months, this truck was the only tangible lead. Detectives screened thousands of registered vehicles, cross-referencing toll data and gas station receipts, searching for a needle in a stack of high-end Florida pickups. The frustration in the precinct was thick enough to touch. They knew that in cases involving high-conflict divorces, the obvious suspect is rarely the one pulling the trigger. They were looking for a surrogate, a hired hand who could move through the night without leaving a trace. It took nearly a year for the shadow to take a name: Henry Tenen, a 61-year-old with a scattered criminal history and a life that seemed light years away from the corporate corridors of Microsoft. When the police finally tracked down the blue truck, the connection felt like a lightning strike. Tenen wasn't just a random driver, he was a tenant. He lived in a house owned by Mario Fernandez Saldana, the second husband of Shanna Gardner. The professional world of Jared Bridegan and the gritty world of Henry Tenen had finally collided in a paper trail of property deeds and rental agreements. But a rental agreement isn't a murder charge. The detectives needed more. They needed the money. Financial forensics began peeling back the layers of Mario's bank accounts, looking for the currency of a life taken. They found it in the form of 3 handwritten checks. These weren't anonymous wire transfers or bags of cash dropped in an alley. They were documented payments from Mario to Tenon. The timing was surgical. The payments felt like a down payment on an execution. Despite the mounting evidence, the investigation remained a game of tactical patience. Mario was the bridge, but Shanna was the destination. Detectives turned their attention to the digital footprints Shanna had tried so hard to erase. They executed search warrants on her private communications, digging into the years preceding the murder. They found a pattern of solicitation that turned the stomach. They discovered that Shanna hadn't just been angry, she had been shopping. She had allegedly asked a local tattoo artist if he knew anyone who could get rid of her ex-husband, a request so blunt it seemed almost absurd, until it wasn't. The digital shovel dug deeper, uncovering search queries and messages that suggested a mind focused on elimination. Shanna was no longer just a grieving ex-wife. She was the architect of a vacuum. In January 2023, the first domino fell. Henry Tenon was arrested. The man who had been a ghost for nearly a year sat in an interrogation room, facing the weight of a first-degree murder charge and the prospect of the death penalty. It didn't take long for him to break. In a move that sent shockwaves through the Pacific Northwest, where Shanna was hiding, Tenon pleaded guilty to second-degree murder. But he didn't just confess. He flipped. He admitted to being the one who pulled the trigger on that dark stretch of Sanctuary Boulevard, but he insisted he wasn't the mastermind. He was the tool. He identified Mario Fernandez Saldana as the man who had hired him, the man who had handed him the gun and promised him a life changed by a Microsoft executive's blood. With Tenon's testimony, the noose tightened around Mario. In March 2023, he was taken into custody, charged with first-degree murder and conspiracy. The red herrings of a random robbery were officially dead. The investigation had moved from a dark road in Jacksonville to the inner sanctum of the Gardner-Fernandez household. Yet, Shanna remained in Washington, surrounded by the silence of her family's estate. The detectives knew they were playing a high-stakes game of legal chess. They needed every scrap of evidence, every ping from a cell tower, every witness statement from the CrossFit gym, every deleted email, to be bulletproof. They were building a case against a woman who had the financial power to disappear. And they only had one shot to bring her back. The community watched as the legal system ground forward with agonizing slowness. Every day Shanna remained free was a fresh wound for the Bridegan family. Rumors circulated that her family's wealth was being used to insulate her, to buy time, to wait out the clock of public outrage. But the detectives were methodical. They were tracing the origin of the gun. They were analyzing the GPS data from Mario's vehicle. They were reconstructing the moments Shanna and Mario spent together on the night of February 16th, looking for the flicker of a conspiracy that had turned a spare tire into a weapon of war. The investigation had moved past the who and was now cementing the how, preparing for the moment when the billionaire's daughter would finally have to trade her designer clothes for a jumpsuit and answer for the blood on Sanctuary Boulevard. The legal walls, once reinforced by millions of dollars and a continent's distance, finally began to crumble in the summer of 2023. In the quiet, rainy enclave of West Richland, Washington, the billionaire's daughter narrative met the cold reality of a federal arrest warrant. On August 17th, ATF agents and local police surrounded Shanna's home, a scene that stood in stark contrast to the manicured temples of her youth. She was taken into custody in front of the twins, the very children she had used as pawns in a decade-long war of attrition. The extradition back to Duval County was more than a flight. It was a journey toward a final reckoning. Shanna Gardner, now wearing a standard-issue jumpsuit instead of designer athletic wear, faced a judge who didn't care about scrapbooking empires or high society lineages. The charges were as heavy as the Florida heat: first-degree murder, conspiracy, and solicitation of a capital felony. Beside her stood Mario, both of them facing the state's ultimate sanction, the death penalty. The trial process transformed into a marathon of high-stakes legal maneuvering. Her defense team fought every piece of digital evidence and every witness statement, attempting to suppress communications that hinted at the murder-for-hire plot. But the testimony of Henry Tenon, the man who had already admitted to pulling the trigger for a promised payday, loomed over the defense like a shadow. Mario Fernandez Saldana, meanwhile, maintained a stoic silence. His fate intertwined with the woman he had married during the height of the conflict, The resolution was no longer a question of if, but when, as the world waited to see if the woman who sought to erase a father would find her own future permanently deleted by the law. The stains of that February night long washed away by the Florida rain, but the silence remains heavy, a permanent, echoing void for 4 children caught in a war they never chose. Jared Bridegan lived to build homes, software, and a future. Shanna Gardner lived to control. The empty chair at the table isn't just a symbol of a lost life. It's a testament to the price of a cold, calculated ego. Justice moves forward, but the legacy of the night road trap is a loss that no courtroom verdict can ever truly repair. The tire in the road was meant to stop a car, but it ended a world. For the Bridegan family, the nightmare has transitioned into a long, quiet grief, a life lived in the shadow of a woman who chose elimination over compromise. Please like this video and share your thoughts about this case in the comments. Be sure to check out our previous videos as well. See you soon.